Okay, I think we're going to begin. I think other members may be coming, and so we had votes that delayed this, so I apologize for that. And there are going to be votes coming up again, so I want to try to get as much of this in as possible. But I want to wish everybody a good afternoon. Welcome to this hearing of the bipartisan Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Today we return to a topic Co-Chair Smith and I explored 4 years ago this month in a hearing titled Accountability for Russia's War Crimes and Aggression Against Ukraine. With the war now in its 5th year, much of what we see has not changed. Ukrainian territory remains occupied by Russian forces. Soldiers still die in combat. Civilians are killed, and they suffer. A UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry has concluded that Russia has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity against the people of Ukraine. No peace without justice, said Frederick Douglass of an American freedom struggle. The people of Ukraine are in one too. They also know that a just and lasting peace demands accountability. At our 2022 hearing, David Crane proposed an international tribunal to address Russian crimes in the conflict. Last June, one was established. His advocacy worked. Dr. Crane is here again, and we want to welcome him to tell us how the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine will work and how the U.S. can support it. In addition, Ukraine is pursuing a genocide convention case at the International Court of Justice. And in 2023, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Russian President Vladimir Putin and another official for unlawful deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children to Russia. That is the topic of this hearing. Abducted children are a heart-rending issue of abiding interest to Americans and others around the world. First Lady Melania Trump has been a vocal advocate working for the return of Ukrainian children, with some success. The United States is invested in this cause. Some 20,000 children have been transferred to Russia, of which 2,048 have been returned, according to a Ukrainian government figure. Today's witnesses will update these figures and help us to understand the scope and the scale of Russia's crimes. It shocks the conscience. Each of these numbers represents a young person suffering terrible psychological trauma. We have reports of Ukrainian children being adopted by Russian families, of Russians indoctrinating Ukrainian youth with ideological training, paramilitary drills, and religious instruction, and of separated families being forced to organize their own efforts to find one another. Most children face very limited paths to return. We've seen this evil before. Chinese authorities sending Tibetan children to colonial boarding schools. American and Canadian officials doing the same to indigenous children. It always leaves a stain. We seek recommendations for what Congress and the U.S. government can do to bring these children home and to get them the psychosocial support that they will need. One thing that we should not do is abet Russia's crimes. But shockingly, it appears that we are. This morning, the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab released a report that the Russian oil giants Gazprom and Rosneft have been complicit in the trafficking of Ukrainian children. Camps owned or sponsored by these companies or their subsidiaries are where these children are subject to re-education and pro-Russia indoctrination. And yet, just 2 weeks ago, President Trump rewarded Gazprom and Rosneft by temporarily lifting U.S. sanctions on Russian oil to cover his rear end for the price hike spikes caused by this war of aggression with Iran. This means that the U.S. government is aiding Russian entities complicit in the abduction and abuse of Ukrainian children. This means anyone, even Americans, who consumes Russian oil is subsidizing this war crime. I think this is outrageous. I think it is offensive. It must stop. We demand accountability not only of Russian officials, but of our own government. The harm done to these children is immeasurable. The agenda for justice and accountability is clear. As Americans, we should be doing everything we can to support that agenda. That includes demanding that our own government stop helping the bad guys and stand firmly behind the Ukrainian people's right to freedom and to dignity. The spirit of the Ukrainian people inspires us. Amidst the destruction, they hold their heads high with aspirations for their sovereignty, for their dignity, and for their freedom. It is in solidarity with this spirit that we hold this hearing today, and I look forward to the testimonies. We're joined by two of my colleagues, Congresswoman Bonamici and Congressman Doggett, and I would like to yield to them if they have any opening remarks that they want to. So Lloyd Doggett first.
Well, thank you, Jim, for leading on this and on human rights around the world. The forced transfer of children from an occupying country to that occupying state is not a side effect of war. It's a crime. It's defined as such under the Geneva Convention. The International Criminal Court, of course, has already issued arrest warrants for Putin and his assistant who've led the effort to kidnap these children. This hearing exists because accountability for that crime demands our sustained attention, and because that attention is being actively undermined by our president intent on appeasing a war criminal. 3 years ago, along with the commissioners of the Helsinki Commission, I was in the same courtroom in Nuremberg that tried the Nazi war criminals. And we heard from a number of Ukrainian NGOs and officials there about the war crimes with reference to kidnapped children and other violations, the crime of aggression that were occurring in Ukraine. Of course, each year we pass an anniversary and another toll of lives and of children who've been stolen. These Russians should be in a similar courtroom, not directing even more attacks each night, each day on Ukraine. But I'm as concerned, and I'm glad this hearing gives us an opportunity to explore it more, the issues to which Congressman McGovern has already mentioned about what our own government is doing to subvert the efforts to find and return these children. The Trump regime went after the children by cutting the funding for the U.S.-based programs that were responsible for tracking thousands of these children. I led a bipartisan group of colleagues in urging the State Department to maintain funding for the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale, a program the Ukrainian government has relied upon to identify these children. And that request to state was flatly denied. And so after the denial, a group of us, 50 in all, sought funding for the continuation of the work of that Yale lab. Yale's program has been forced to survive on private donations, and its future remains deeply uncertain. We were actually successful in getting an appropriation for Yale, and yet the money has never reached Yale. In its latest report, documents that Rosneft and Gazprom are directly involved in trafficking Ukrainian children are significant. More than 2,000 children were taken to Russian, quote, re-education camps, that is, deny your Ukrainian heritage and culture camps, owned by Rosneft and Gazprom subsidiaries. By Trump lifting sanctions, these companies are now free to sell Russian oil, as are the Iranians who are firing the missiles at us because the sanctions were lifted on them also. They can bank billions for the Kremlin war machine and face no consequences for their role in child trafficking. Trump is helping the companies trafficking these children while cutting off the people trying to find them. If he truly cared about Ukrainian children, he would immediately reimpose these sanctions on these two companies. Instead, when the State Department learned of the Yale report, they ceased all contact with Yale. Yale was supposed to receive $5 million of the $15 million that we secured in appropriations last year for these efforts, money that is now in jeopardy. Yale told the truth about Trump's policies and what they meant for trafficking children. Like so many others, it's being punished for truth-telling. The leaked communications between Steve Witkoff and Putin assistants only confirm what the pattern already shows. The Trump regime's approach to Ukraine has been grimly consistent from the start. Appeasement, condemning the murdered, calling it peace. Whatever Putin wants, he seems to get. Meanwhile, Ukrainians are huddled, through the winter without heat, children on playgrounds are ducking missile fire, and 35,000 kids at least are sitting in Russian facilities waiting for someone to come for them, and we can't maintain the funding for the critical American entity that has been tracking those kids. The witnesses before us today, we're very fortunate to have. I know you've done painstaking, courageous work to document these crimes and to keep the world's attention on the children that Putin has stolen. They deserve a government that supports their work instead of sabotaging it, as has happened. 35,000 children are waiting. This hearing is not enough, but it is a start, and we will not stop here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me yield at this time to the co-chair, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman, and it's unfortunate that we have to be here for this very important hearing. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling the hearing today. And, we do have we're very different on a lot of policies, but when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to a whole lot of human rights issues, there's no space between us. I do want to say how happy I am to see both David Crane and David Schiffer, who we've worked with for many, many years. Matter of fact, it was David Crane who testified at one of my hearings when the war of aggression first started with Putin, that we should not just look for like the ICC or some other body to take this on, that you didn't even need the Security Council to do it, but to bring an action within the General Assembly to hopefully get a prosecution underway immediately. I offered a resolution right away, went nowhere. I asked the Secretary of State under the previous administration to do just that. I went to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in Manchester, England, and asked everyone there to consider having your country try to bring such a war crime tribunal configuration, creation. It would only take one country to do so. But it was David Crane who said, there are a lot of options before us on how to hold this man who's committing a war of aggression, and just attacking innocent people every day of the week. And the abduction of children, which is the only part that the ICC so far, maybe there's others that I've missed, that they've seen that as a war crime and it needs to be prosecuted. But again, David, I want to thank you because we really tried so hard. And I do hope the day will come when Putin will be at The Hague, just like Milosevic, just like Charles Taylor and so many others who ended up, and you did the great work with Charles Taylor way back, to bring justice to these butchers. So I want to thank you for that. Of course, the children have not only been abducted, but they're also being just brainwashed into a cultural, reject your Ukrainian culture and accept the Russian culture in all ways, shapes, and forms. So I would ask you, I'm just going to my full statement be made a part of the record, but I do think we need to continue to bring light. The administration needs to, as it always does, as did the previous one, need to do more. We just need to do more. I mean, Putin is a war criminal with very few equals ever. This war of aggression, totally unprovoked, it just needs to end, and it needs to end as quickly as possible. But those kids have to get back to their families. I would finally just say that, there are some, I've been working on the issue of another co-conspirator, and that's Lukashenko, for decades. I wrote the 2004 Belarus Democracy Act, which freed a lot of people. We had a lot of great work with the administrations over the course of years to get people out. And I'm happy to say that Lukashenko let another 250 people out. Yes, there was a quid pro quo, but when you're suffering in prison and you're being tortured and every other deprivation you could think of as being imposed upon you, it's good to see the daylight. I've met, as we've had hearings with a group of Belarusians, leaders, including Sergei, I should say, who would have won the election, and his wife did win the election, Svetlana, and that was all stolen by Lukashenko as well. So as we seek justice against Putin, Lukashenko has to be a close second, if not 1A. But again, we got to get these kids back. And Putin and his co-conspirator in this has been indicted. That has to move aggressively. And it can. The ICC has abilities and capabilities that, if there's a political will, they could do more. So thank you, and I look forward to your testimony, sir.
And let me yield to Ms. Bonamici and Ms. Capter if they want to have any brief opening remarks.
Yeah, my remarks will be brief. Thank you, Co-Chair McGovern and Co-Chair Smith, for this important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for your expertise. We know that since the start of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, that there have been countless war crimes committed, and one of the most egregious is the campaign of abducting Ukrainian children and forcibly transferring them to Russia. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court defines crimes against humanity to include deportation or forcible transfer of a population and enforced disappearance of persons. And a report authored by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine found that Russian authorities at the highest levels of government have coordinated actions to facilitate the long-term placement of children in the Russian Federation from the occupied areas of Ukraine. As a mother and a grandmother, this is gut-wrenching and wrong. The UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry found thousands of documented cases of children who were kidnapped from Ukraine, 80% of whom have not been returned. Russia is taking children from their families and their communities at alarming rates. The Ukrainian Ministry of Justice estimates that approximately 20,000 children have been taken to Russia. These egregious crimes against humanity must be prosecuted at the highest levels and those responsible brought to justice. I have Mr. Crane and Representative Capter sign on to your legislation on the International Tribunal. And I just want to thank, again, the witnesses for being here today to shed light on these crimes. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about what we can do as members of Congress to help end these crimes against humanity and bring these children home. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Co-Chair Smith, for this opportunity, and thanks to each of you who have taken time out of your lives to do something truly extraordinary, and including being here today. Thank you to the Yale contingent that did a lot of the research and amassed the information that we can place into the record. And wouldn't you know that Rosneft and Gazprom would be ideological partners with a truly dark state we call Russia. It's my understanding that over 20,000 Ukrainian children have been taken away from their families and moved across the border. I've actually met some of those families that struggled for years to get their child back, and what happened to that child, and how do you deprogram someone that's been reprogrammed across the border. It is something that most Americans will never experience. And I know that the Lantos Foundation, I had the privilege of serving with Tom Lantos. He would be very proud, he is very proud of the moment that we have this hearing today in his memory. No one fought harder for liberty in Central Europe under communist domination than did he. And I wanted to, I'll have some questions, and I think,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, you will allow that later. Is that correct?
As soon as the witnesses testify, we'll turn to questions.
Okay, very good. And just to say that I look forward to your testimony, and on behalf of each child that is having so much of their humanity stolen as we sit here today, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And I want to welcome our witnesses again, and let me introduce the panel here. Katya Pavlovich is policy advisor with Razom for Ukraine and the American Coalition for Ukraine. She's an advisor on the issue of Ukrainian children abducted by Russia since 2022. She's the founder of Forget Us Not, an initiative to coordinate and empower civil society efforts on the return of abducted children. David M. Crane is the founding chief prosecutor of the UN Special Court for Sierra Leone, the world's first hybrid international war crimes tribunal. Dr. Crane is assisting in the creation of a special tribunal for Ukraine on the crime of aggression, our topic today, which has earned him sanctions by the Russian government. He served 30 years in the federal government, including as director of the Office of Intelligence Review in the Department of Defense. He's the founder of the Global Accountability Network, which has promoted justice in Yemen, Venezuela, Syria, and Ukraine, and for the Uyghur people. Ambassador David Sheffer was the first U.S. ambassador at large for war crimes issues at the U.S. Department of State from 1997 to 2001. In government, he also served on the Deputies Committee of the National Security Council and as senior advisor and counsel to Madeleine Albright, ambassador to the United Nations from 1993 to 1996. He has experience in an international law firm, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the U.S. Institute of Peace. From 2012 to 2018, he was the UN Secretary General's special expert on UN assistance to the Khmer Rouge trials. Ina Liniova is the director of the Human Rights Institute of the Ukrainian Bar Association. Previously, she was executive director at the association and held senior management roles in the in international technical assistance projects funded by USAID, the Council of Europe, and the European Union, all supporting justice sector reforms in Ukraine. She is a Ukrainian lawyer with expertise in transitional justice, human rights, and the rule of law. I thank you all for being here. Ms. Pavlovich, we will begin with you.
Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, and distinguished members of the Commission, I thank you for holding this important hearing on the issue of abducted children of Ukraine, which is the largest case of missing children since World War II. Russia's abduction of Ukrainian children, important to remember, is not the crime of the past. It is an atrocity that continues happening right now. That means that our responsibility is accountability, yes, but also, most importantly, stopping and rescuing these children right now. We often refer to the number of 20,000 children, but I think for accountability purposes, another number also matters. 1,600,000 Ukrainian children remain under Russia's occupation and are subjected daily to indoctrination and militarization. They're drafted into the Russian army and turned to the Russian soldiers. Abduction and militarization may seem like two different crimes, but in fact, they are part of Russia's overall goal, which is erase children's identity and break their ties with Ukraine. We cannot take Putin at his word when he promises to return those children voluntarily. We have to look at the past, at the facts. As it was mentioned, the UN did recognize the abduction of Ukrainian children a crime against humanity and a war crime, and 80% of the children that they found deported still remain in Russia. 4 years since the invasion started, 80% of children continue being in Russia. To date, Ukraine has managed to rescue more than 2,000 children, but it's worth noting that 95% of those rescues were executed not thanks to Russia's cooperation or goodwill, but by dangerous rescue operations organized by Ukrainian civil society in collaboration with government and international partners. I do want to acknowledge a very hopeful diplomatic development. The involvement of the First Lady has helped return 20 Ukrainian children back home, including those abducted from Kherson Children's Home in 2022. Back then, the nurses of the children's home hid the kids in the basement of the Baptist church nearby, but weeks later, their location was revealed by the Russian soldiers, and at least 46 children, all under age of 5, were stolen and placed illegally for adoption. This is a photo of a 6-year-old Milana and a 4-year-old Makar, their kids' names have been changed, who were brought back just recently to their mother after spending 3 years in abduction. The boy was abducted when he was 10 months old. They were reunited due to the efforts of the First Lady. And for that, I want to personally thank the First Lady for her leadership, but urge her to continue her mission because thousands more Ukrainian children are waiting to be saved. But it is up to Congress to help the administration and the First Lady in this challenging mission. We have to act fast because Russia's priorities are reflected in its budget to expand the infrastructure of militarization. Its youth policy budget has grown 85% since the 2022 invasion, and today it exceeds $1 billion. A vast share of these funds is allocated to paramilitary organizations like the Movement of the First, whose annual budget is comparable to an annual revenue of the whole Russia's region. As a result, already at least 400,000 Ukrainian children have been enrolled into Russia's paramilitary organization. And if this means anything, it's that Putin is not preparing for peace, he's preparing for war, and our policies have to reflect that. Congress has already appropriated funds to document the evidence of this crime, and I applaud this move, but I believe we can do more. Congress should appropriate funds to support the search, rescue, and rehabilitation of Ukrainian children. It is a crucial part of accountability because every rescued child becomes a witness whose testimony helps bring those involved in the crime to justice. Here are the practical steps Congress can take. First, Russia's abduction of children is a state-run operation financed by the federal budget. That budget is fueled by the oil industry. Moreover, as we learned today from the Yale's newest report, Russia's Gale oil companies are directly involved in financing the illegal transfer and re-education of Ukrainian children. We find that American taxpayers are now involved in the business of enabling the Russian war machine, and this cannot continue. There are 9 bills in Congress right now to impose sanctions on Russian oil, but Congress hasn't passed any of them yet. I urge Congress to pass the DROP Act and the Shadow Fleet Act to help slow down the Russian war machine. Second, the President Trump is negotiating peace with Putin, and we must remember that the return of abducted children must remain non-negotiable. Children cannot become bargaining chips for Putin, and I urge Congress to pass HRS 564 and SRS 236 that state just that. Third, I invite Congress to reconsider the engagement with representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church, which has collaborated with the Russian government to deport and militarize Ukrainian children. As someone who was baptized in the Russian Orthodox Church, I regret to admit it is an arm of the Kremlin, not of God, and we should treat it as such. Our commitment to Ukraine's children must be reflected in our budgets, policy, and public statements. Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, thank you for your leadership on this issue, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, and I just want to acknowledge the presence of Representative Landsman of Ohio. I'm grateful that he's here, but let me go to you, Dr. Crane.
Chairman, and members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, just thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I specifically want to commend Chairman Smith. He and I go back 24 years, and we've been through the fire together, and I just want to note that for the record, and how proud I am to be a small part of the good work that you and Chairman McGovern and all the members of this commission are doing. I also want to commend Congresswoman Kaptur, her leadership on House Resolution 777. I had the honor and pleasure of working with her staff last summer to draft a non-binding resolution to just commend the Council of Europe and Ukraine to just come together and created something what I think is quite extraordinary, and that is the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Today I will give you just a real quick overview of the agreement and the statute that created the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. I had the pleasure of chairing a high-level working group that worked with and advised the Council of Europe and the core group of nations on the creation of the Special Tribunal. 2 of those members of the working group are with me and testifying today. It took us 3 years and 2 iterations of the working group to put together this particular unique court. Today, and I really want to emphasize that with Chairman Smith, because I remember that hearing where we talked about the idea of this. Today it's a reality. We did it. In a world turned upside down, where the rule of law is being attacked around the world by dictators and strongmen, Europe, with Ukraine, created a new international tribunal. It is a victory for the law and for justice. It is the first ever court to use the new modern-day concept of aggression to hold President Vladimir Putin and his henchmen accountable for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. On 25 June 2025, agreement between the Council of Europe and Ukraine established a treaty-based special tribunal to prosecute senior political and military leaders responsible for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The agreement itself creates the court institutionally, while the attached statute defines jurisdiction, structure, procedures, and applicable law. And I laid all that out for you in my remarks, my written statement to you. The tribunal focuses exclusively on leadership responsibility for initiating the war. It complements the International Criminal Court and allows broad international participation through the concept of an enlarged partial agreement, and represents a landmark effort to ensure accountability for aggressive war under international law. I just want to thank you for your attention, and once again on this extraordinary moment in legal history, a moment whose cornerstone is the international military tribunal at Nuremberg, created 81 years ago this year, whose purpose was to hold accountable those who committed international crimes, to include aggression. I would respectfully ask that my brief remarks be entered into the record, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and your remarks will be entered in their entirety into the record. Ambassador Sheffer.
Thank you to co-chairs McGovern and Smith and the other members of the Tom Lantos Commission. I submitted a more detailed written statement for the record. In the late 1980s, I was a lawyer with the Committee on Foreign Affairs and knew and consulted very often with Congressman Tom Lantos. It is an honor to appear once again before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. I was deeply involved representing the United States in the creation of 5 war crimes tribunals during my government service in the 1990s. When the February 24, 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces began, I immediately collaborated with many colleagues, including my co-panelist David Crane and later Ina, to strategize the creation of a special tribunal that would investigate and prosecute the acts of aggression committed by Russia against Ukraine. That task proved to be a long and winding road towards the establishment of a mechanism of accountability. And Chairman Smith, that General Assembly idea was the best, but it had to be put aside for another alternative that was inspired by David Crane's thinking.
So was the General Assembly.
But the Special Tribunal finally reached takeoff in June 2025. The Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine is a natural and entirely predictable consequence of the Russian invasion of and continued armed attacks against Ukraine. There is no surprise in the establishment of the Special Tribunal other than the precise character of its origins and constitutional framework. Each modern war crimes tribunal has had its novel characteristics. It is inconceivable that a war of aggression like that conducted by Russia against Ukraine for more than 4 years would escape accountability under principles of international law and international criminal law. If the leading perpetrators of the crime of aggression against Ukraine face no accountability, then there will be little prospect of this international crime being enforced in the future. Acts of aggression and the crime of aggression have an 80-year history of codification and prosecution under the law. The United Nations Charter embeds the suppression of acts of aggression in its core principles. The Nuremberg and Tokyo International Military Tribunals were established under American leadership with the primary objective to prosecute the wars of aggression committed by Germany and Japan. A significant number of their political and military leaders were convicted of conspiracy to wage aggressive war and of crimes against humanity or crimes against peace or aggression, and were sentenced to death or to imprisonment. In 1974, the United States actively negotiated and joined in the UN General Assembly's adoption of Resolution 3314, defining acts of aggression, which later became the basis for the definition of the crime of aggression under Article 8 bis of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which is now mirrored in Article 2 of the Statute of the Special Tribunal. The hard work of criminalizing acts of aggression in recent decades began in the early 1990s with the UN International Law Commission's draft statute for an international criminal court in 1994. Remnants of how aggression was handled in that draft are reflected in the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. During the negotiations leading to the Rome Statute, there were persistent efforts to include in the ICC's subject matter jurisdiction the crime of aggression alongside genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. As head of the U.S. delegation to the UN talks on the International Criminal Court, I stressed that a war of aggression akin to the German invasion of Poland in 1939 should be the context for inclusion of the crime of aggression in the Rome Statute. Russia's massive invasion of Ukraine in 2022 obviously would meet that requirement. Negotiators, however, were not able to find an acceptable comprehensive definition of the crime of aggression by the end of the first round, or the final round of negotiations in July 1998. Thus, the inclusion of the crime of aggression in Article 5 of the Rome Statute was a placeholder until the treaty could be amended in the future with a workable definition that would be essential in order to investigate and prosecute the crime. That was achieved in Kampala in 2010, and the Rome Statute now includes the detailed provisions that have operationalized the court's jurisdiction over aggression. But the crime cannot be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court with respect to the Ukraine situation for reasons I can explain later if you wish. Hence the need for the special tribunal. My point is that the prosecution of the crime of aggression became deeply entrenched in historical precedents immediately following World War II, in modern legal theory, and in judicial bodies created by the collective will of sovereign nations. The special tribunal fills a jurisdictional gap in order to ensure that the crime of aggression, which is a leadership crime, can be investigated and prosecuted against Russian leaders. Now, when the special tribunal ultimately adjudicates the cases on the crime of aggression committed against Ukraine by individual Russian political, military, and perhaps business leaders, as well as accomplices that may be identified by the prosecutor in the leadership ranks of Iran, Belarus, North Korea, and China, those cases can proceed toward trial even in the absence of the indicted fugitive under Article 28 of the statute. There is one exception. Article 23(5) of the Special Tribunal Statute would suspend the confirmation of an indictment until a head of state, head of government, or minister of foreign affairs no longer holds that office. Vladimir Putin thus avoids trial, even in absentia, as long as he holds on to supreme power in Russia. But Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, for example, may step down from his duties sooner. The Russian defense minister and all Russian military leaders involved in planning, preparing, initiating, or executing acts of aggression against Ukraine would not qualify for suspended treatment under Article 23(5), and thus could be prosecuted in absentia or in person if successfully arrested as soon as cases are developed and indictments rendered against them. It is important to understand, particularly in the context of who would be targets of investigation and prosecution by the Special Tribunal, that Ukraine has endured rolling aggression on a massive scale since February 2022, not to mention Russia's earlier aggressive actions that commenced in February 2014 on the territory of Crimea. By rolling aggression, I mean that a war of aggression and acts of aggression do not necessarily occur on only a single day or with the initial cross-border assault. There have been daily aggressive cross-border and in-territory assaults against Ukrainian military and civilian targets by Russian forces, artillery bombardments, powerful missiles, and autonomous weapons like drones for more than 4 continuous years. As a consequence, there is an enormous amount of evidence, much of it already collected, to substantiate charges of the crime of aggression against the Russian leadership, and fresh evidence accumulates every day as a consequence of rolling aggression. 2 very short final points. Further, the Special Tribunal probably will take judicial notice of the aggressive war early in its jurisprudential record. This is a step similar to what occurred before the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in 2006, when it took judicial notice of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda as an event that no longer needed to be proven in each individual genocide case before the tribunal. The genocide in Rwanda had become an obvious fact for purposes of criminal prosecutions. The conclusion that aggression occurred against Ukraine will become, I predict, a judicially recognized fact that no longer would need to be proven in the courtroom. And there's an article in the Special Tribunal Statute that provides for that. The Special Tribunal cases thereafter would center exclusively on whether the indicted individual being tried in person or in absentia participated in a leadership role in the commission of the acts of aggression against Ukraine. And finally, the Special Tribunal still requires preliminary spade work to become functional. Financially, it needs rapid infusion of funds to build the staff and support the administrative and managerial requirements of an investigative and prosecutorial judicial tribunal. It also needs diplomatic support so that more nations join the enlarged partial agreement and then the management committee of the Special Tribunal. Funding and in-kind support can be sought from governments as well as the private sector. In the United States, there are sources within the private sector, particularly among the diaspora of Ukrainians living and working here, who might find good reason to support the cause of international justice for their native land and people. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Liniova?
much better, sorry. Apologies for that. Dear Chairman of the Commission, distinguished members, colleagues, I first of all also would like to thank you in organizing this urgent and very important hearing and for an opportunity to testify before the Commission on behalf of the Ukrainian Bar Association and its Human Rights Institute. Since 2022, the UBA, the Ukrainian Bar, has been actively advocating for accountability for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and aggression committed in and against Ukraine since 2014. While all international accountability mechanisms have been triggered in response to the war, significant gaps remain, creating a risk of impunity. The International Criminal Court, as we mentioned today, investigates war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide committed in Ukraine as of 2014. We also mentioned that it has issued arrest warrants against the President of the Russian Federation and the Children's Rights Commissioner for illegal transfer and deportation of children amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity. It also issued arrest warrants against military officials implicated in attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. The ICC does remain the central institution establishing individual accountability for the crimes committed. However, in practice, it can only address a handful of cases, focusing on those most responsible. At the same time, it is unable to exercise jurisdiction over one of the four core international crimes, the crime of aggression, as Professor Crane has mentioned. The International Court of Justice is examining a dispute under the Genocide Convention. Importantly, the court is not determining whether Russia has committed genocide. Rather, it is addressing Russia's unfounded allegations that Ukraine committed genocide and the legal consequences of such implications. In its provisional measures, the court ordered Russia to suspend all military operations, an order that has been blatantly disregarded. Earlier in 2024, the ICJ delivered a judgment in a separate case concerning financing of terrorism and racial discrimination. The court did find certain violations by Russia. However, the judgment also again demonstrates the structural limits of the court's treaty-based jurisdiction. While it can establish specific violations, it is not, unfortunately, equipped to address the core illegality of the war itself, leaving a critical accountability gap. In July 2025, the European Court of Human Rights delivered a landmark judgment finding systematic and widespread human rights violations by Russia dating back to 2014. Among other findings, the court established an administrative practice of transferring Ukrainian children to Russia and facilitating their adoption there in violation of multiple provisions of the European Convention on Human Rights. It further required Russia to cooperate in the establishment of an independent international mechanism for identification of such children and ensuring their safe return home. Crucially, the court also recognized that Russia's rhetoric, policies, and conduct reflect a broader objective, the destruction of Ukraine as an independent state, sovereign state, and subject of international law. This judicial recognition is of profound importance. It brings us directly to the central gap in the current accountability framework, the crime of aggression. The recently established special tribunal that we're discussing here is designed to address this leadership crime. An agreement has been signed in June 2025, and now it is essential the states from various regions of the world, not only Europe, join and support this initiative. The importance of prosecution of aggression is not new. As Robert H. Jackson stated at the Nuremberg trials, aggression is the supreme international crime because it contains within itself the accumulated evil of all of them. Today, we are once again confronted with the need to give effect to this principle. We urge the international community to ensure that the tribunal becomes operational without delay, ideally in 2026. Dear members of the Commission, supporting accountability for the crime of aggression in Ukraine is fully aligned with the mandate of this Commission to promote, defend, and advance human rights globally. Ensuring accountability for the gravest violations continues the legacy of Tom Lantos and reinforces the principle that such crimes must not go unanswered. In light of the above, finally, would respectfully urge this Commission to support several key steps. First and foremost, urge United States authorities to join the enlarged partial agreement on the establishment of the tribunal, thereby setting an example to other states as well. Provide financial support to ensure functioning of the tribunal and its establishment as soon as possible. Support Ukrainian national level accountability efforts, which will address the vast majority of crimes. About 99% of crimes will be addressed at the national level. Strengthen American investigation of war crimes committed in Ukraine under the principle of universal jurisdiction, which is already being done now, but it can be extended in scope. And finally, ensure that the identification and return of children unlawfully deported and or transferred to Russia is treated as a non-negotiable priority in any diplomatic engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You heard the buzzers, which they call votes, just, at the most inopportune time. But let's see how much we can get through here, and then we might have to negotiate with you about coming back after votes. But anyway, before I go to questions, let me ask unanimous consent to include in the hearing record 3 items: a statement from the Committee to Protect Journalists, a statement from the U.S. Ukraine Foundation, and a report from the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab on the role of 2 Russian oil companies in the trafficking of Ukrainian children. Let me just say, one of the things that frustrates me when I'm watching news programs and people are talking about Ukraine, U.S. government officials, so-called experts in the field, is that I often get frustrated that they don't focus in on human rights nearly enough. Sometimes human rights is never even mentioned. And what we're talking about here today is beyond atrocious. I mean, the kidnapping of children, the brainwashing of children, the intimidation of little children. You talked about, kids. You showed us pictures of kids like 4 or 5 years old. I mean, like how evil can things get? And so let me just ask a few questions here, Ms. Pavlich. We know that there are challenges related to the reintegration of abducted children back into Ukrainian society once we can get them back. What are some of the issues or trauma that must be addressed, and what types of psychosocial support do they require? And is this adequately provided by the Ukrainian state, or are there gaps, and who can fill them, and can we do more on that?
Thank you for an excellent question. It is a very overlooked subject. We are so focused sometimes on getting children back from Russia, and we also have to address, okay, how do we help them when they are released? So it really depends on each individual child returned. After the return from abduction, children are assessed and their needs are assessed. And depending on the case, medical assistance is provided, mental health support. A lot of these children have an educational gaps that needs to be filled, needs to be really addressed. And the Ukrainian government has a coordination center that created the system that called Children Path, through which every child is supposed to be taken, their needs are assessed, and the recovery could take, depending on a case, from 3 months to a year and a half. But the need for mental health recovery, which is challenge number 1, is so great that the government of Ukraine just physically cannot fail in this demand alone. So it collaborates with multiple Ukrainian organizations to provide, first of all, psychological help, but also a lot of social service. Majority of children that are returned from abduction, among them, there are children who have not been abducted, but they were about to be abducted or drafted to the Russian army. So they are evacuated from occupied territories. And that means they have no home of their own. They're taken from their homes. So providing them with the housing, providing them with educational needs, they also receive financial support. And as we know, Ukraine used to receive a large amount of aid from Ukraine, from the American agencies, and right now this aid has been cut significantly, so we hope that the future appropriations in 2027 will address those needs.
But clearly, we need to refocus on these issues, and I appreciate your answer. Let me just ask, I mean, You know, we're talking about this report today. Do you have, anybody here, any response to the report by the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab as reported in the Wall Street Journal that Gazprom and Rosneft or their subsidiaries own camps where these children were detained? I mean, like, how should we respond to this terrible atrocity?
If I may, as it was mentioned in my testimony, I urge the Congress to really pass the legislation that is right now in place to impose sanctions on the Russian oil industry.
We just lifted sanctions on the Russian oil industry. So clearly we need to go in the opposite direction. Dr. Crane?
You know, corporations are a lurking shadow behind atrocities, and we've seen that. I saw it very much so in West Africa with diamond dealers, gun runners, and thugs moving minerals as well as guns and stuff back and forth. They are clearly aiders and abettors to atrocities. The challenge at the time that I was in West Africa was I didn't have the jurisprudence to go after corporations, and it is a weakened structure criminally to go after corporations internationally. We don't have really an in-depth jurisprudence to do that, but I would just like to point out that in these dirty little wars of the 21st century, women and children pay a particularly heavy price wherever it may be in the world. And lurking behind all of that are corporations aiding, abetting, providing various support to various factions within a conflict, and that is a challenge.
Well, I mean, the issue is how do we keep them accountable? I mean, Ambassador Sheffer?
Just to add to what Mr. Crane has stated, bear in mind that at this time, the International Criminal Court has already indicted Putin and Belova on the child abduction charges and forced deportation. They have the jurisdiction to look at the leadership of the oil companies to find out where were decisions made and by whom to actually collaborate in the crimes identified by Katya. So at some point, those individuals, not the corporation itself, but the individuals in the corporation might find themselves under focused investigation and ultimately indictment for aiding and abetting essentially what Putin and Belova have been charged
Maybe
with
we can
doing.
play a bigger role in helping to highlight who these people are for the world to know, because they're making money now, and they're making money from U.S. citizens, basically, who are buying, their oil. Ms. Liniova?
I wanted to contribute to what my co-panelists already mentioned. I think 3 accountability mechanisms are possible under these circumstances. First of all is to empower and continue supporting the ICC, which is addressing war crimes and crimes against humanity. The second one is to support the establishment of the tribunal, which will have a big deterring effect for businesses as well, because they will see that accountability will come after them. And the third one is to prosecute these corporations at the national level, even in the U.S., provided that the principle of universal jurisdiction can be applied. But cases like this exist in certain European countries, and it is possible.
Well, maybe, Dr. Crane.
Nothing wrong with naming and shaming. It's bad press for any corporation to be named in something like this. I think I would respectfully ask that you could consider holding a hearing on this very same point.
Yeah.
And bring him in and ask him why.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good suggestion, and maybe we can continue to work with you to figure out ways to, again, focus in on, their atrocities in all of this, because quite frankly, I want to make sure everybody in this country knows who they are. And I'm going to yield to Mr. Smith. I would just say to everybody that there's 5 minutes left to vote, but 366 people haven't voted. So
Always a good sign.
yeah, so I'm going to go vote. But if you guys can stick around, some of us may come back and have further questions.
First
I'll
of all,
yield to you.
thank you for your very powerful testimonies. And Dr. Crane, Chief Prosecutor Crane, your leadership on the ad hoc tribunal and the convictions that you got, the infrastructure that you left in Sierra Leone was breathtaking, at great risk to yourself. And I think a lot of people need to realize how at risk you and your fellow prosecutors and investigators really were during those difficult times. So thank you for that. And when you speak, we need to listen. And Ambassador Sheffer, you as well. You've been there right from the start, doing a wonderful job. So thank you. I do have a couple seemingly esoteric questions. First of all, I'm all for this. I think it's tremendous. I do hope it succeeds. Any way we can help, we got to do it. I hope Marco Rubio and others will fully embrace this. With all due respect, we did not get the previous administration to do this. And I asked over and over and over, and now we'll ask again, because it's not too late. Accountability, ominously, you made a very strong statement, David Crane, back when you said, if we don't do something here, all the strong men around the world will take note, and they'll realize there's no accountability, so they can do whatever the heck they want. So thank you for that admonishment. It's Ukraine first. We got to care, but there's also a whole lot of other potential victims that could be malaffected. Let me just I worked very hard on the Yugoslav court, offered amendments when a study, I believe it's called the Shell study, I got to remember the exact name, found that we were significantly underfunding it, almost to fail. I offered an amendment to beef up the funding big time. I wasn't the only one who felt that way, but I did do the amendment. And lessons learned from all of those courts that we have had, including yours in Sierra Leone, lessons learned. I mean, when you mentioned, Ambassador Sheffer, 23.5, that as long as Putin stays in office, he can evade prosecution, then he'll want to stay in office till he dies. But again, charging other people with very serious crimes, which they committed and were accomplices in, might get them to turn. Now, one of the things, and maybe this has been fixed in this, or you're going to fix it, there was no plea bargaining capability in the past, if I'm not mistaken, and that led to not being able to get the higher-ups. I mean, I met with Milosevic in Serbia, face-to-face. The guy was an absolute thug, but he didn't have much concern that anybody was going to turn against him, and of course, he never got justice because he died while awaiting trial. But is plea bargaining something that ought to be looked at, not because we want to let somebody to get off, but so that we can get the higher-ups like Putin? And then on the funding issue, how do we make sure that we don't underfund this? Because, funding, personnel, investigators, the whole 9 yards is needed for success.
One can, that's part of a prosecutor's, and I'm putting on my chief prosecutor hat, plea bargaining is a tool. It's a valid tool. There is very little history in plea bargaining at the international level. It's not prohibited. It's just not largely done. I almost had someone very bad about to plead guilty, but he had to consult with his witch doctor, and I threw out the whole process. I'm not going to negotiate with a witch doctor. That's another story, perhaps. But the point is that there's a lot for a prosecutor can do with this statute and this agreement. There's all kinds of tools by which, even though we can't actually have Putin sitting in the dock, we can do all sorts of things that would name and shame him, put him in the indictments of others, et cetera, et cetera. We can go all the way to an indictment. In other words, we can actually indict him. We just can't go any further than that until he leaves office. But again, as Ambassador Sheffer very correctly stated, the bottom line is that once they leave office or have left office, and a lot of the ministers of defense are out there, have left office, they are very, very culpable and would in fact be indicted for the crime of aggression. So a lot of naysayers in this saying, well, we really can't get Putin. Well, we really can get Putin. It's a different angle of doing it. But the bottom line is the world will know with the special tribunal going through all of the facts and circumstances, going into court, showing the world what he has done officially on the record is also very, very powerful. And of course, he will go down in history as a mass murderer and an aggressor.
I would just add to what Prosecutor Crane said that, while it's not literally called plea bargaining, a defendant can be educated by the prosecutor and others that, if you move in a certain direction here, when it comes to sentencing, it's something called mitigating circumstances that can work in your favor to mitigate a sentence, even though you'll be proven guilty, you will still have a mitigated sentence, so.
Mr. Chairman, would you like us to stay here and yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right, I apologize for the votes, but the good news is there are no more votes for the day, so we won't be interrupted again. But I'd like to now yield to my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Landsman, for any comments and questions he may have of the panel.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you all for coming in. For those folks who may be watching and don't know, and they're just coming back to this, during the course of this war, Putin's war in Ukraine, they've stolen at least 35,000 children, which is an insane statement in and of itself. The idea that a single child would be stolen, abducted, and it's tens of thousands of children. We've been able to track most of these children because the State Department, working with Congress, invested in a program using satellite imaging and on-the-ground intelligence to figure out where these kids went, so that we can, one, hold everyone accountable, and two, get these kids back to their families. That was cut off last year. We still don't know why, but Congress made it very clear that it was a priority. We were able to get language in the appropriations bill to say, look, this is an incredibly important program. You can't just steal 35,000 children and get away with it. We are going to continue to invest in it. This Congress said it in a bipartisan way. This Congress said we are going to pay for this program. Now, coming out of it, as you all know, and we're having this conversation today, the administration has just lifted sanctions on these Russian oil companies, including two that are involved in the abduction of children. And this comes from a report from this organization, and I just want to quote something and then ask you all to share whatever thoughts you have with this committee as to what we should be doing. Quote, until the sanction regimes targeting these two oil companies, Gazprom and Rosneft, is imposed, the United States is now, however, inadvertently aiding and abetting organizations that make up a vital part of Vladimir Putin's industrial-sized campaign of abduction, deportation, indoctrination, and coerced adoption of children from Ukraine by Russia. I'm wondering, one, do you agree? And then two, what is your advice for somebody like me who is just profoundly disturbed and confused by how a government, our government, is saying, no, we are no longer going to sanction. By the way, we were only sanctioning 20% of their oil. So 80% of what they were doing, no ramifications at all. Now we're saying 100% of your oil, sell it. It's tens of billions of dollars, at least $10 billion. I'm so confused as to how our government is allowing this to happen. So if you all could just weigh in on whether or not that statement is true and what we should be doing.
I'm happy to start. Thank you for the question. So I agree with the statement. It is not surprising, even though the findings are deeply disturbing. For me, as someone who's been researching this for 4 years, it's not surprising to know that government-run companies are suddenly involved in abduction of children. This is what happens in Russia. This is what happens in any dictatorship. Business, religion, culture become the arm of the regime. And we cannot separate or isolate parts of Russia with which we want to collaborate and exclude them from overall regime. The way to address it, I think, let's remember that there are other ways that we can support the issue of abducted children without the sanctions, even though they would have to be the core of our efforts. Let's remember that America is holding currently $5 billion of Russian state assets, and under the law, they actually should be transferred to Ukraine and be paid as reparations. Why don't we pay them with reparations to children who have been returned, rescued, and send Russia a very strong signal? And that will cost American taxpayers nothing. We have to continue intelligence sharing because it also contributes to Ukraine's effort in finding and locating these children. But if we're talking about passing legislation and appropriations the best thing I found that is working is finding allies. We all here present and many millions of Americans are deeply concerned by human rights violations when it comes to abduction of children, but there are all these political calculations that kick in. Well, security, well, negotiations. Let me put it from a different perspective. The militarization of Ukrainian children is not just the largest act of human rights violations, it's a national security threat to America and NATO. 400,000 Ukrainian children have already been militarized. How many will in 5 years? If we will not save these children, we'll end up fighting them.
It seems to me that there are two very terrifying and immediate war tactics that I've seen both now in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe with Putin's war in Ukraine. One is rape as a weapon of war, and the second is stealing children. And we're allowing this to happen in Ukraine. We're allowing this to happen, and you have these two oil companies, something like 44 of the entities associated with these oil companies could be sanctioned. I'm curious if we sanction 100% of these two companies, which we should, based on their involvement, would that have the impact? Tell me what impact it would have.
As I mentioned earlier in my comments, I believe that Chairman McGovern had kind of alluded to, and I talked about, these are shadowy figures in the background of atrocities that don't see the light of day. And so, as I've been reflecting on what Chairman McGovern said and what you were obviously alluding to, is that we need to bring them out of the shadows in practical ways, hearings, naming and shaming through op-eds, through various other kinds of academic forum, roundtables, what have you, is also very, very powerful. Op-eds, in other words, these players in this shadowy world in the background of aiding and abetting whatever makes a profit do not like to see the light of day. Sanctions are sanctions, and they may sting, they may not, but they do not like the light of day. They're like vampires. And so, we had the very same challenge when I was chief prosecutor in West Africa. We had a lot of corporations moving about, mainly dealing with diamonds and blood diamonds. What I was doing was truly the blood diamond story. And so we named and shamed the De Beers Mining Corporation, who were very much involved in all of this. And so, they did not like that. But what it did is, as I was showing the light of day, they created a system by which now the Kimberley process, by which all diamonds being mined have a serial number on them so that they can be followed, and that when someone's buying a diamond, they can be assured that it's not a blood diamond. So there are, the industry itself, in order to correct and show that they're doing something good, that's the Kimberley process. And so that's just a natural outflow of showing and getting them, showing the light of day. Talking about child soldiers, I had 35,000 child soldiers walking around Sierra Leone, destroyed human beings who will never, ever recover from this. And I really want to say this because I think it's really important for this audience and as well as people listening in. These are human beings. These are one children at a time. We tend to group them in large amounts, and numbers matter from a realistic political point of view. But I was in one of my town hall meetings where I went out and talked to the people of Sierra Leone, and I was in McKinney, the headquarters of the infamous Revolutionary United Front that cut off body parts to terrorize the government. And my practice was, much to the uncomfortableness of my close protection officer, I stand among the people listening to them. And so I was about an hour into a town hall meeting, and a young man stood up. I was told he was 12 afterwards. He was ragged. He was yellow from malaria and other diseases. And he fell into my arms, and he said, "I killed people. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it." And as he was weeping into my arms,
He was a kid.
he was a
He was a
kid,
child.
and he was a monster. He was a rapist, a murderer, what have you. So what's going on here, and because we were at the end state, you know, they would recruit these children, just like Russia's doing, and then turn them into soldiers/monsters. Well, that's kind of the same thing that's happening with Russia.
May I contribute to what my co-panelists say, and I completely agree with Katya and with Dr. Crane. Russian oil and gas are, and will be the tool of influence of the Kremlin, and the war in Ukraine will not end until sanctions are imposed, as simple as that. And imposing sanctions and confiscating Russian sovereign assets are the necessary measures. They are not only the only alternative to the war, but they are as countermeasures, they're absolutely allowed under international law.
Yeah, there's got to be a line that you can't cross, and stealing children has to be part of that global line that people shouldn't cross ever. And if they do, they should be punished to the fullest extent of every law, international, otherwise. And the fact that this administration has the ability to sanction every single cent of these companies that are key to continuing this war in an attempt to end the war and stop the abduction, stealing of children, and the idea that they're doing the exact opposite is so profoundly disturbing to me and deeply frustrating. My hope is that, you know, what happened last time was that the evangelical community, people of faith all over this country, when they heard about the fact that there are tens of thousands of children that had been stolen and that there was a database tracking them so that we could get them back to their families, that the administration cut off the program, the database was about to be deleted, they started calling the White House. One of the reasons why we were able to get this thing turned back on is because the evangelical community, people of faith all over this country, started to call the White House and the State Department. I hope they do that again. They need to do that now on these sanctions, on the frozen assets. You know, the only way to make this something that ends up being less than a nightmare is to get these kids home. And that means picking up the phone and calling the White House, calling the United States Senate, and other folks here to make sure that we're all aligned in holding these people accountable. Anyway, thank you all for your leadership.
Well, thank you very much. So I think this commission is going to try to find a way to make the lives of those associated with these oil companies as miserable as possible, and we will work with you to figure out how to do that. Let me ask you. You know, I began by saying I get frustrated sometimes when I hear people talk about Ukraine and they neglect to talk about human rights. I mean, there's all these different ways that we're going to bring this war to an end, or how we're going to get Russia to do this or that, and we never talk about the stuff we're talking about here, and we're not talking about human rights in a way that I think really we should. And so let me ask you. I mean, maybe anybody who can answer this. I mean, are human rights part of the current negotiating agenda led by the president's envoy, Steve Witkoff? I mean, does anybody want to comment on that? I mean, yeah, Ambassador.
Yes, Chairman McGovern. I think I'll comment generally about that. I don't, not party to those negotiations, but you know, it's become a reality in recent years, and always has been, but certainly has accelerated, that warfare is conducted against civilians and not just military targets. You know, as an international lawyer, one becomes very familiar with being able to distinguish between the military advantage of hitting military targets, and of course the illegality of hitting civilian targets, although at times when, there are instances where there's collateral damage and things of that nature. All of that can be taken into account. But what is so astonishing about the Ukrainian experience is that it is a full-scale assault on a civilian population. Full scale. There's military involved. The Ukrainian military is obviously out there fighting courageously, and I see has just recovered some territory that it had lost before. But the point is, the kind of assaults that the Russian military make, particularly with missiles and drones, hitting the energy infrastructure of the country, all of that is an assault on the civilian population. And abducting the children is another assault on the civilian population. It has nothing to do with military targets whatsoever. And that is, I think I'll just recall, once February 24th, 2022 occurred, I remember, within a week or two saying in the media, this is the largest scale assault on a civilian population that we have seen in such a rapid period of time and so decisively that we have seen since World War II. It is a direct, targeted assault on a civilian population. So, by the way, may I, Chairman McGovern, just make one point for Congressman Landsman? I dealt with the budgets of tribunals for years and years, trying to secure the necessary funding for them, et cetera. I think one point that can always be made about, helping out the Yale Humanitarian Lab, for example, and getting the funding for investigations for the children, et cetera, is that comparatively speaking, we are talking about actually very small sums of money for rule of law exercises compared to military exercises. The rule of law exercises are minuscule in dollars, and yet they have such potential to turn the tide for so many individuals if they're pursued.
I just want to say something. Thank you for saying that. I mean, one of the things that scares me, terrifies me about this new weapon of war, of rape or stealing children, is somebody once told me that the reason folks do it is because it's demoralizing. It destroys the will of the country you're fighting or the civilian population that you're trying to hurt. But it's also free, and we're allowing it to be free or without cost by saying no sanctions, by not holding these folks accountable. I mean, to your point, it doesn't cost much money to do the right thing and hold these folks accountable. If we allow this, one, it's just awful because of the actual children involved, but two, because it allows for this weapon of war to persist because it's so inexpensive for them.
I was sitting here listening to what Ambassador Sheffer was saying, and as I already earlier stated, we're in the dirty little wars of the 21st century where the rule of law is not followed. Women, children, civilians pay a particular price. Over the past year, I've headed a task force that has been putting together a new crime against humanity based on what's going on in the Ukraine, and that is called mass destruction. And we're about to issue a report and a white paper on this new crime to be considered, and that is mass destruction. And that is when the foreign policy of a UN member state realizes they cannot win a war, they just choose to just destroy a member state because they can, as opposed to either withdrawing or entering into a treaty or surrendering or what have you. They're just going to blow the hell out of the place just because they can, and they can't win. And so we have been carefully considering the idea of a new crime against humanity called mass destruction, which is, from an old prosecutor point of view, is an alternative charge to the crime of genocide as well, and that would be useful. So more to follow. We'll certainly get the commission a copy of that white paper, but I think we really we're going down a dark hole here where member states are just going to destroy each other just because they can't win, but they're not going to let it go.
I'm going to yield to Ms. Pavlich in a minute, but let me just say, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that, the way this all ends has to be about more than just signing a piece of paper saying we're not going to, bomb anymore. All these issues that we're talking about here today have to be addressed. And that's why, I asked a question about that human rights needs to be part of the negotiations because, and I know you all have a lot of experience dealing with some really horrific situations, but you know as well as I do, that if you lose a child, if you're somebody you love is a victim, somebody who's close to you is a victim, there needs to be some resolution. You don't just move on and say, "Oh, everything's beautiful today." I mean, these issues have to be addressed. People have to be held accountable, and in some cases, there have to be reparations, to try to deal with the horrors that have been caused. And I sometimes think that we have people who think that this could all be wrapped up nice and neat and tidy and with just a handshake. It's a lot more detailed than that. But Katya, I'll yield to you.
I think I just wanted to address the question of Representative Lensman about where does the issue of abducted children is in peace negotiations. So during the peace talks in Istanbul, Ukrainian side has provided Russian side with a list of more than 300 children's names that they want back, and that resulted in 0 returns, which just demonstrates us where for Russia this issue stands. The return of abducted Ukrainian children, in addition to prisoners of war and civilian detainees, is a part of 10-step peace formula of Ukraine that should be honored because this is such a reasonable request. And the territorial integrity of Ukraine is actually also connected to the issue of abducted children. Although abductions take place in occupied territories of Ukraine, and as we learned today, there's more than 1 million of children living there. Any territorial concession to Russia will mean condemning children living there to militarization, risk of abduction, risk of child trafficking, and other human rights violations. The return of abducted children and civilian detainees was omitted from previous draft that floated in the press, and we hope that the negotiations will include this unconditional, condition. What is important that we cannot agree to exchanging territories of prisoners of war in return of children. They're protected by international law with a special status. But moreover, when we talk about helping these children rehabilitate in Ukraine and ensure they're not going to go through the same horrors again, we have to integrate in the framework of return of abducted children the safety of Ukraine in the future. That means security guarantees and the treaty that will actually sustain Russia and make Ukraine resilient to future Russian attempts. And the treaty has to be ratified by the Senate. Thank you.
So the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, I believe, has issued some informative reports on the human rights situation in Ukraine. And their most recent report was on March 12th. And the commission was authorized by the UN Human Rights Council, which the current U.S. administration withdrew from. Its work is administered by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which the administration defunded. And I discussed this with High Commissioner Volker Turk yesterday. He was in Washington. I mean, do you think the cause of justice and accountability in Ukraine would be better served if the U.S. were supporting rather than defunding the Commission of Inquiry?
This is a very good question, Congressman, and I think we all will agree that it would be better if the U.S. administration supported the UN system and its entities in general. And it's not only the Commission of Inquiry, it's the UN Human Rights Council, as well as the International Criminal Tribunal and other UN institutions working on human rights and rule of law in Ukraine and globally.
Dr. Crane?
Like Ambassador Sheffer and probably those of us that are a little older than others in the room, we've lived through 80 years of rule-based world order which doesn't exist today. And so we have to think outside the box and think of other ways by which we can do the work that we're all doing in this room that assists victims of atrocity, aggression, what have you. And so even though I would love to be able to go back to that four corners, rule of law based world, we're just not going, we're not there. And so my humble thought is, Mr. Chairman, is just we have to turn to other entities, other regional organizations, non-governmental organizations, to do the same thing that we would do if we had a better world. But we still have to do this.
Yeah, no, I don't want to throw away the rules-based order yet. I mean,
do
and
I.
I think that we all agree that, we want to make sure that we continue to remind people about the importance of that and defend it. I mean, oftentimes, countries do things that, quite frankly, deserve to be condemned. I mean, including us. We're not perfect. And I get it. When you get criticized and called out, you don't like it. And rather than trying to change it, the behavior, oftentimes we lash out at the entity that actually brings us, the news or demands accountability. And but we got to find a way, and this is a challenge, is that we have to find a bipartisan way to embrace kind of a international law and a rules-based system, and we have to find a way to have administrations, whether they're Republican or Democratic administrations, not walk away from that, because otherwise, it's like anything goes, and then who do you rely on, and who do we go to, to get accountability? And so I'm kind of worried about the fact that we're not talking more about that.
The special tribunal that we've created was a creature of just that. We started with the UN and tried to mold and shape a tribunal with the General Assembly, and it just didn't work. And so we had to mold and shape and go to a regional organization. So we're going to see, and I think we need to consider, that regional organizations are going to be the cornerstones by which we shape and mold solutions to not just what we're facing today in this hearing, but other challenges around the world. We, unfortunately, have been using the UN, and we still should do that. It's still there, but it needs to operate much smarter than it is now. But I just humbly say that I wrote a paper on this just, 2 months ago about what the world how do we shape and mold a rule-based order world without the United States? And I'll be glad to submit this to the commission.
We would love to see it. And I guess going back to Mr. Landsman's point about sanctioning these, re-sanctioning these oil companies and holding them accountable, that kind of should be a no-brainer. But you know as well as I do, it's going to be very, very difficult in this climate. And I think the sanctions were lifted in part to alleviate, potential hardship on people in this country in terms of the rising costs of energy due to the war in Iran. We could argue whether it had any impact at all, but I mean, I think that was I think that was whoever made this decision. I think maybe that was what was behind it. I think it's going to be harder than it should be to try to get them to reconsider that. And again, if they don't reconsider it and this stays in place, then this is a precedent, which is a really bad precedent. It means that if we perceive that there could be some financial benefit to us by lifting sanctions on a particular entity that is engaged in atrocities, we will put our financial interest ahead of human rights and addressing those addressing those horrific atrocities. We need to create a climate where we can have these very frank discussions, because quite frankly, if there's any short-term gain, which I doubt that there is, the long-term problems that are going to be in place as a result of this, it's going to impact just not this situation with Russia right now, but potentially with other countries down the road. And again, I think we need more voice. I mean, and we appreciate your voices, but I'm just saying, some of these issues need to be elevated, even more. And I just, let me just, I have one final thing that I'd like to raise. I mean, Ambassador Sheffer and Ms. Leniova called for more diplomatic support for the enlarged partial agreement, including from the United States. I wonder if you could just expand on this, and what government should we be urging to support this, and has the U.S. government responded to this appeal positively or negatively?
I don't know to what extent our current government has responded to that particular appeal, but I will just say that the objective is, first of all, you want your European colleagues in the Council of Europe. We're not in the Council of Europe, but obviously the European nations should be moving towards this, because as an organization, they entered into the agreement with Ukraine. Now, individual governments have to ratify that in terms of their participation in the overall venture. But we've always talked about how important it is to get some Latin Americans, some Africans, some Asian nations into the enlarged partial agreement. And it seems to me that one could strategize from an American point of view, if we can demonstrate bringing some of these other non-European nations into the enlarged agreement, along with ourselves, we might, just under the current perspective of things, we might be able to gain some diplomatic leverage in various ways by doing so. It is not an expensive proposition. It's not as if when you join the enlarged agreement, you're automatically assessed, for, these are voluntary contributions that one is looking for. And so I think from the American perspective, if the concern is money, I wouldn't place that in the way at all. I think it's more one of demonstrating that we can bring other countries with us for a good cause. And if I can just answer your larger point, Chairman, which is bringing both parties together on things like this. During Democratic administrations, including the Biden administration, people like me are all over the place, talking, around the world with groups, et cetera. It didn't matter whether it was a Republican or Democratic administration. If the United States was perceived as exercising double standards, I would be raked over the coal in these meetings by just being reminded, yes, you just said this as a matter of principle or human rights values, but we will now demonstrate to you that the United States conducts itself in a double standards context. Why should we take you seriously? So I think, and that was true, during the Biden years too, that call was out there on double standards. So I would just say that, if some focus could be put in terms of when decisions are being made on foreign policy, et cetera, put yourself in the perspective of the global South or otherwise. Would they perceive what you were doing or deciding to be a demonstration of double standards?
Well, I think we're at the end of this. Is anything we left out that you want to say for the record? I'll give you the opportunity if anybody has anything to add, or did we exhaust everything? Doctor.
Just real quickly, I'm on a task force with the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, talking and thinking about dealing with the abduction of children. But I'm, going back to this Gazprom thing, they do business around the world. They have other companies that they,
Turn your mic on.
I apologize. I'm usually pretty good at this. But if they hear that, let's call it what it is. Stealing kids is bad for business. And that's really the theme. And the companies that they're doing business with, who may have some ethical bones in their bodies, don't want to deal with companies that steal kids. And so that is another tactic by which we need to kind of think that through, because if we have this motto of, just that, I would offer that as a thought. It's a simple thought.
It's a great thought. No, if we can't persuade them, we'll shame them. Yeah, got you.
If I may add, I just want to reiterate the thought that militarization of children poses national security threat for the U.S. and NATO alliance. And I would seek the support of other committees on the issue, national security, armed forces, because, again, the pace at which Russia militarizes children is much worse than we imagine. NATO doesn't militarize children, NATO countries. We will not be able to match Russia in human resource, cynically speaking, when it comes to the next invasion, which will not be limited to Ukraine. So I urge you to ask for alliances and collaboration with other committees and members of Congress who may not be as deeply involved in human rights issues, but in national security issues when it comes to the U.S. Thank you.
A very brief comment, if I may, 2 comments. Actually, I wanted to echo what Katya said, and add that even the European Court of Human Rights in a judgment acknowledged the threats by the Russian Federation to other countries and said that the Russian politics is a threat to peace and justice in Europe and in the world to that extent. So reacting to the atrocity crimes in Ukraine is not only about the Ukraine, it is about the world. And of course, we remain at the disposal of the Commission for any further action that is needed. And my second point, very briefly, is thank you to the Commission and to the U.S. authorities for all the support to Ukraine since 2013, 2014, and counting. Thank you.
Well, we got some follow-up to do here, and I'll just close with my co-chair, who was here in the beginning. We're of different political parties. We have a lot of different views on a lot of different things. But the one thing we both believe in is that the United States, if we stand for anything, needs to stand foursquare and out loud for human rights. That's our strength. That's in our national security interest, and it's just morally the right thing to do. And I think to the extent that we have any influence at all to help people escape some of the worst atrocities you can imagine, we have to do everything we can to do it. So we look forward to working with you, and I thank you all for being here, and this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.